Very good morning, sir,
Good morning.
and welcome to AHRD.
Oh, thank you.
We are fortunate that this digital class initiative has been taken, and I'm sure the reach will become more global in the days to come. So, we all are aware that the first video or the link to the climate survey was shared by sir, and our fellow students have raised certain queries based on that video, and we take the opportunity to get it answered none by none other than you, sir.
Yeah.
So we go ahead. The first question was given by Miss Ayushi Darshana,
Okay.
and she has first of all thanked you for sharing this very original and a very authentic work. The question she has raised is, how is time spent at one's work linked to productivity? And second, her concern is how this methodology, which was used for manufacturing sector, could be customized for service or other sectors, again in terms of productivity and flexible work from home culture.
Okay. This, first of all, remember that this study was on small scale industries where the employees may be sometimes 20 to 30, 40 to 50. And small scale industries in manufacturing sector require workmen to keep working. So a simple method is whether the person is found working when you observe them or not. Percentage of the time the person is found working is a very simple measure of productivity that we have used. It does not measure the quality of contribution. It doesn't measure any other variable. This is the dependent variable. In the research study, independent variable is organizational climate as well as the aspirations of the person. So these measurables are pure in terms of whatever research design we have had. So we have not measured the quality of contributions, and that is, of course, if you can't generalize too much on this. Second issue that whether it is manufacturing sector or service sector or any sector, I think the number of time the person has been found to be working versus not working is a good measure of productivity. Go to a government office and go around checking, noting down, use the same methodology, you can establish productivity index in terms of simply number of times the person has been found to be working. Because you find many times places where people are just sitting and whiling away time, etc., etc., and so on. Services sector, go to hospital. I mean, I was recently in a hospital. I had an opportunity for a week to go around. So I can observe many times people are simply chit-chatting. Now, if they chat among themselves, one can put a question mark. Are they discussing a patient? But nurses normally don't discuss a patient. It is a doctor versus a nurses and so on. That is why in this study, before we undertook the study, we understood the roles of each workman. So it helps us, where in doubt, to take a judgment in more in favor of the person is working or not working. So this study is simply about working, not working, and is not a very sophisticated study. Remember 1967-68, small industries, that is the setting. So it has limited kind of a thing.
Right, sir.
Which
So
is the next
in
question?
that, the next question is from Mr. Sunil.
The same person. Have I answered both these questions?
Yes, sir. The first question was one's work linked to productivity, and second was this methodology be used for other sectors. The second question is from Mr. Sunil, and his question is how climate survey could identify workers' orientation on desire to add value, which is vis-a-vis earning salary at the month end. Second, addressing issues like sense of belonging, fear of redundancy, loss of job, and the third is spiritual quotient.
See, these are all concerns of today. In those days, the concerns of workmen may have been slightly different. I think there was no insecurity in those days. In fact, I think the fear of the management was formation of unions. In small scale industries, of course, there is no such kind of a thing. You can add any number of variables as independent variables to study. We have not studied the desire on the part of the workman to contribute to the organization. That's not there. And remember, we have used only a 23-item organizational climate questionnaire, which measures opportunity to express one's feelings, improvement in work conditions, supervisory behavior, participative kind of culture, work breaks and so on. These were the kind of things that were a reality in those days. Today people are sophisticated. People link it with incentive system, salaries, link it with, I think, hygienes, motivators, all kinds of variables come into picture. But those days, simple workman, 20, 25 items, look at the organizational climate. You study only those, because the questionnaire was developed on interviewing a large number of a group of workmen, their supervisors, and asking them the question, what in your view is relevant today, what impacts your, what is likely to impact your work behavior. So these are the items. In fact, those were the days when Lickard's first book on, the book on new patterns of management that described organizational climate in large industries came into picture. We looked at a whole lot of items, found that many of them were not relevant. We only picked up, I think, what is relevant for the current study and so on. Other variables, I think this is a very simple study, came out of a desire that what impacts the productivity of the small scale industry people. And the assumption was, if there are some 20 different variables in organizational climate, if they impact, then we can manage the culture in such a way that productivity will improve. And that is the hypothesis. Very ordinary kind of a study.
Right, sir. Okay. So the next question is from Ms. Amisha Vyas, and she has asked that will the observations made in this study hold true in today's environment, given the following parameters. First is financial pressure due to increased materialism, distractions due to social media, societal pressures on account of nuclear families, and increase in education which has generated awareness for rights, and many times this leads to conflicts in an organization. So do you think these four
My
parameters?
first reaction to this is a very good question. I think even in sophisticated area like medicine, we find results of one particular period are not necessarily valid. What works today doesn't seem to work. For example, I think very recently I have heard many people talking about how the blood sugar or blood pressure variation comes depending upon the time at which you study. So if in, let us say 40 years ago, 70 to 110 was considered normal blood pressure, today given all the conditions, I think it is nowhere near. 90 to 140 also may be considered normal blood pressure. Somebody the other side said even 200 points of sugar is acceptable. So if that is a kind of sophistication, how can you expect in management where which is filled with the people or industry, what is observed on one particular period is likely to be true in another period, and what is observed with one organization is likely to be true. So I don't want to assume that any relationships that are formed, that is why we have innumerable kind of studies. Second thing I did not mention in my talk, we found that organizational climate is not related to productivity when you looked at 8 industries and combined the sample. But when we did industry-wide study, 2 out of 8 industries we found relationship, statistically significant relationship.
Okay.
But when you combined all the sample, the relationship was not there. So can I say in industry X, the organizational climate impacts productivity, whereas in organization Y, it does not impact productivity.
Right.
That is a sensible kind of a thing to make.
Right.
So then, in which case, I think should an organization which has not conducted the study say, in my company, will organizational climate impact productivity and so on? That's, in my view, that is not necessarily a good question to ask. I would ask the question that it is mandatory for everyone to improve organizational climate with the hope that it affects productivity.
Right.
Whether your research wise you have demonstrated it or not. Now tell me, does academy's climate impact productivity of people?
It definitely does, sir.
Now suppose in the same institution, somebody perceives the climate in a positive way and somebody finds it in a negative way. So the person who finds it positive, is the person likely to work better as compared to the person who doesn't perceive it?
Definitely, sir.
That is what you and I assume. But the study shows in general it need not. Which means there are other factors that are impacting productivity.
Right,
In
sir.
2 companies, climate is affecting productivity. In 6 other companies, something else is affecting productivity. We have not studied those. So I would say every organization should find its own method of researching and finding out what are the variables, and these variables may not be static over a period of time. They may keep changing and so on. So I hope that answers Samisha's question.
So moving ahead, the question has come from our fellow student only, Sandeep Kumar. He has asked that are climate surveys impacted by hygiene factors or motivators? So there are about 7 questions, so I think we'll go one by one.
Let me answer that.
Yeah.
Yes, both hygienes and motivators impact productivity, and both constitute organizational climate. Normally when you take organizational climate studies, you have variables that ask about the mundane physical working conditions, and that also ask about sophisticated participative values, supervisory behavior, leadership styles and so on. I think there is so much. In fact, Academy has published a whole book of organizational climate surveys listing out a whole lot of tools. So if anyone is interested, they can write to Academy, get a copy of this book. I think hygienes, motivators, both of them figure out in this.
Fair enough, sir. The second question is, are any recency effect biases at work? Example, new hires, salary reviews.
Well, I would assume perceptions of organizational climate is impacted by recently happened events to some extent. You cannot totally rule that out. Okay. But I think the example he has taken, reviews and other things, that is just an illustration. There can be many other things that happen in the life of an organization. I assume it impacts to some extent, but not to 100% extent.
Right.
But again, there is an issue. If I have to learn one lesson from this, that in 6 out of 8 industries there is a relationship between climate and productivity. There is no relationship. In 2 there is relationship. I would also say some variables affect some people more intensely than the same variable that affects other people. For example, a salary review, same salary review that has taken place in a company, same magnitude, might intensely affect X, whereas for Y it doesn't matter. And Y, he may say that, look, I have not come here for salaries, and all this whole world is biased, even gods are biased, I don't care about these salaries. So that means it may or may not.
The morale,
life is a lot more
sophisticated. Impact on the morale is very different.
Yeah. So I would always, that is why I always say research studies in management, behavioral sciences, human resource development are highly contextual. They are meant to give you an orientation to life, orientation to work. For example, I have learned so many things on this. This way of productivity can be measured. Now, how I have used it subsequently, I have, for example, in a hospital, I have used this not to measure whether a nurse is working or not. I mean, we have done this study, Uday Parikh and I had done it in Indonesia. I would simply go around using this methodology, work out my path, go and see and observe and note down what the nurse is doing. Now here, working or not working is not. Is the nurse preparing the bed, lifting the baby, giving an injection, talking to the doctor? I mean, these were the kind of things. So from this, we came up with a whole lot of tasks. So methodology helps you to understand and build your sensitivity to organizations and organizational phenomena. So research studies have to be taken with a pinch of salt. Now, I don't want to say whatever we have observed is always true. Sometimes it may be true, sometimes it may not be true.
Fair, sir.
Yeah,
the third question is, do factors like relationships with supervisor and boss also impact the score?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there were questions here which were not directly questions in the organizational climate, which deal with supervisors about supervisory behavior. I am encouraged to give my views and opinions. Or when I give my views and opinion, my supervisor listens to me and accepts it. In a 5-point scale, you measure. But what we have not done was pick up this particular item and relate with productivity. We didn't do the item-wise analysis with productivity. Maybe that could have been done to find out which of these 23 variables affect productivity and so on. That level, at that time, we didn't go.
Yeah. Okay. And the next question is, what about management style? Example, paternalistic, delegatory, team or individual contribution culture?
Yeah, there is a question in this which measures the style of centralization versus
Okay.
participatory style.
Okay.
It's a part of the organizational climate.
The next question is about the VUCA environment. Do factors like psychological safety play a role in such VUCA environment that we live today?
That's a very general question, nothing to do with the research study. So I would certainly think yes, of course,
Right.
VUCA plays a role.
Thanks. The next question we'll take up is from Mr. Rajan Sinha, and he's asking that whether busyness as assessed by work study or activity sampling would be a reliable indicator of productivity, because smart workers would be able to turn out larger quantum in less time.
I think there are so many dimensions of productivity. Quantity of work, quality of work. If quantity is zero, quality is not likely to exist. If quantity is very high, we can't guarantee that quality is directly proportional or inversely proportional. These are sophisticated variables. In this case, we have only measured the amount of work. We have not measured the quality of work. But it's a good question to ask. If somebody can measure both the quantity as well as the quality of work, it is always good. But quality of work, even in the best of performance appraisals, have not yielded reliable kind of results. So it's very difficult to say in a research study it will make much of a difference.
Fair enough, sir.
Okay.
So largely the questions which came from the fellows have been answered. What would be your advice of how they can take this
Well,
study
first
forward?
of all, I am very happy that you have to read this, you have to listen to the talk if you have to ask questions. So I am glad that so many people have listened and then asked questions. The questions deal with contemporary reality.
Right.
The study in terms of methodology is valid for
Right.
any point of time.
Fair enough.
We cannot say findings of a particular point of time can be generalized.
Right.
But this was a good, for that matter, I would say even a doctoral program, a doctoral research is an exercise in research methods. You don't expect earth-shaking kind of findings from a doctoral program. This is of course a research project. This came out of a very genuine interest on the part of CET Institute, because I think today's work environment, workmen are saddled with so many of the other kind of things. So how can we motivate them? How can we get them to work? What are the psychological and organizational factors that are impacting productivity? That was the question in 1965, 66, 67, Soma Chattopadhyay and a whole lot of them were asking. So I think it was an interesting study. If you ask me to replicate this study today, I probably will have a little more sophisticated instruments. I can still replicate it and suggest to a company what is the use of this and so on.
Right.
Subsequent talks we will talk about it. So this is number one. I mean, treat this as a good exercise, and I think we should do whatever we do it in a perfect kind of way. Having said that, it's not that the findings have no relevance. There are some interesting findings here which I have not discussed. One of the findings is those people who have higher skill base and qualifications perceive the organizational climate better.
Okay.
That was an interesting kind of a finding. That means it's good to educate people so that they are able to interpret the organization, tolerate the organization, and things like that. Like that, there are many interesting kind of findings which may still be valid. So if you read this, it will be more for understanding research methods than to generalize the conclusions from there. And,
Right.
So I'm happy that they were trying to link it with the current environment. There are some linkages. So
I'm sure somebody picks it up and tries and develops it
right.
further under your guidance, and that can become another tool in the contemporary context.
Yeah, I mean, they can do that.
Yeah, sure.
My guidance is not necessary.
Fair enough.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for
Thank you so
your
much,
time,
sir.
and thank
We
you for
look
asking
forward
all
to the
these
next
questions.
video being published and
Yeah.
taking the digital class forward.
Yeah, I would, as